parents, we lived in Germany as children, so the slopes are very close by, and at the time it was the sport that everyone did. That's what you did at the weekends, and it snowed a lot, so we all learned to ski. Moved back to the UK after that, but my sister and I always wanted to go and do seasons again. And so we did. She did a few, and then went back to the UK, got married, settled down, had kids, and I stayed. So my first season that I did was in Zermatt, and actually I've just stayed here for the last 20 years, and sort of moved from school to school, going through the sort of the instructor process through to running ski schools, and now owning one myself. And it's, gosh, it's such a learning curve, and I learned so much all the time, quite apart from running a business to running a business in another country, to being in the Alps, to recruiting and everything else that goes with it. So it's I love it. It honestly feels like every day is a school day. Brilliant, fantastic.
That's great. That's really good. Well, congratulations. I know it's not easy to do any of that stuff, not in your native language or country. And Switzerland is its own beast that is unlike anything else too. So
yeah.
Well done you. I always think it's like Bermuda, where you've got to know the secret handshake in order to get in and do your thing. But that's great. Okay. Yeah. So let's, so basically the question that we're discussing is thinking about, there's been a lot of conversation this year in the press on the slopes, and certainly in the boardroom, suggesting that the sport is becoming unsustainable, increasingly exclusive, and potentially damaging to the environment. And what do you think about that? Do you think there's any truth to that? Do you think it's a load of crap? Do you think it was ever thus? Really curious to hear your thoughts.
I think there's a lot of truth to it, to be honest. I think there's a lot of things there, which I'm sort of going to try to sort of pick out the highlights if I can. Firstly, in the press, there's definitely some press in the UK that loves a doom and gloom story about these kind of things. Obviously, that sort of thing's always going to sell well. But there were some fairly major articles this winter that were fairly damning about the state of the Alpine winter, the European Alpine winter. It was a pretty poor winter in terms of snow, so it was sort of justifiable, but obviously, it's not always like that. And this is a bad winter. 2 years ago, we had a huge winter, and now, of course, we've got a slightly later winter. The environmental impact of that, obviously, let's talk about slightly separately, but winters do come and go to a point, and obviously North America have had a huge one this winter. So I think it's challenging, and we're all here in the industry doing our best to sell what it is that the industry does. So sometimes it can be quite challenging when you read that kind of press that a lot of people rely on, because what else are they going to do? So we did have a few people cancel this winter. We had quite a few people ask what the conditions were like and when the next snow was going to come, which that's absolutely fair enough. But I know a lot of it was precipitated by a lot of the information that was abound in the press. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that it is sustainable, and from an ecological perspective, like I said, I learned to ski when we were skiing around on the foothills of the Alps at 40 minutes drive from Munich when I was a kid, which is quite some time ago now, and exactly, but I'm pretty sure that isn't possible anymore. School trips, if you live in,
so sorry, Rowena, it's not possible because the snow doesn't come down, the snow line doesn't come down that far.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. At least not consistently that they're able to open the slopes and for people to know from 1 week to the next whether or not there will be good snow, which then of course will have an impact on the businesses and whether or not that for them is going to become sustainable. Which is something that we've seen a lot in Switzerland. And I know Digby, for example, will have talked to you about the situation with some of these smaller resorts that now just can't afford to stay open anymore. So they can't afford the snowmaking. They're not high enough to be able to warrant the snowmaking as well. And so it falls on some of the ski resorts like Zermatt, Chavinia, which is where I work, who have the infrastructure because they've been able to invest in that over longer periods of time. And obviously we have the altitude here to be able to make it work. But it's sad. We very much, everyone I think who works here wants it to be a sport for all. But as the snow line slowly rises, that becomes harder and harder because the resources are fewer and therefore the demand increases and therefore the price goes up. That's
So
really tough.
it's becoming a more exclusive just
It
by virtue of lack of demand.
I
Sorry,
think so.
lack of supply.
Correct, exactly. I think that's the main problem. And even if you get a few good snow winters, if we see that the general trend is not in that direction, it's so much harder then economically for the industry to be able to make available those resorts and those slopes and those areas for families and for children to be able to come and afford to learn to ski.
So skiing is, you could say skiing is losing out and the summer sports are gaining because resorts are getting smarter about repurposing their whole infrastructure for any kind of activity germane to the mountain. Are you seeing that happen, or is that very slow in coming around?
That's an interesting question. So a lot of resorts have started to work pretty hard and are marketing very well their summer activities, and without wanting to have too wide a brush to make these generalizations, it tends to be the lower resorts that have had to think sooner about this sort of stuff, and they've seen the impact sooner than some of the higher resorts like Zermatt. Zermatt's been pretty slow off the mark, I have to say, partly because they haven't needed to as yet. So I think it's a little bit of the environmental impact, but also a little bit of the kind of the where people are coming from to visit Zermatt from and when they're coming and the kind of things that they'd like to be doing. And Zermatt is therefore picking up on that and moving with that a little bit more as well. So we get an awful lot of people who come from the Middle East and the far East, Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, who come in the spring and the summer months. And they're not looking for necessarily high octane sports in the way that some people who do come along to Zermatt for in the winter, or ski resorts in general. So they are looking at things like e-bike hire and walking routes, and specifically talking about walking routes, for example, so that you can see certain type of flowers or certain animals. And that's all very well put together. That's some of those guided routes are very well marshaled and managed by Zermatt Tourism. But I know they would prefer to be able to push that more into skiing. That's definitely their bread and butter.
And what do you think about the charges leveled at the industry that it is inherently unsustainable?
Unsustainable in terms of economically or environmentally?
Nope. Environmentally, sorry.
I think that's true. I think it's got a I mean, I don't have all of the information as to how much longer we'll be able to do this. I'm not sure a lot of people have, but I would say 20 years from now, it could easily be that there are very few resorts left in Europe where you can go skiing for anything outside of, let's say, January and the middle of February. So I think that ends up becoming an issue as well for the industry, because I think they can see that, and therefore they're trying to make as much money as possible in the time window that they've got left, which then makes the sport even more exclusive and more untenable for those who don't have a private yacht and a private plane at their disposal.
I mean, in terms of what it does to the mountain itself, do you think that it is the charges being leveled at the sport in terms of what are we doing to the mountain? Do you think that's fair? Or do you think that it is a lot of drama over something that's truly not going to move the dial one way or the other in terms of the death of the planet?
That's a good question. It definitely does have an impact. And anyone that's gone to a ski resort in the springtime to see what some of those slopes look like, or the amount of work that has to happen to maintain some of the lifts and the lift stations in the summertime, and that definitely, would otherwise be beautiful pasture land for grazing animals, etc. If the lift stations and the slopes weren't there. Equally, I think it has become a little bit of a focal point for the problems of climate change, where actually I feel as though the focus should be perhaps aim somewhere else. But it's interesting, and it's interesting and very important to see what the output of that is on the Alps. Not to say that we're not playing our part, but I think it's a much smaller part in the resort perhaps than a lot of areas that have much larger impact. Obviously, there's the wider thing as well about, you know, people traveling to ski resorts and how far they're traveling and how they're traveling to get here. I mean, we have people who are now, due to the Icon Pass, for example, which is a big international ski pass based in Colorado, I think I have that right. They get 5 days in Zermatt on their ski pass and 5 days in Chamonix. So quite often they will fly over from the States for 5 days to ski in Europe and then fly back again. I mean, that feels quite painful when we're looking at the big picture, environmentally speaking.
And Americans are not known for taking long trips. They for them a week is all they take because they get no holiday. So anyway,
absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
I have I've heard a lot more about the Icon Pass this year than I ever have before, and certainly met fellow Americans in the lift line that were doing just that. One final question for you, which certainly we don't have to publicize, but it is, I am curious, you run a ski school. What is your plan B?
It's a very good question, and absolutely fair to ask it. You know, if we're talking about this sort of stuff, and I'm working in this industry, you know, I don't know quite what the analogy would be, sort of sitting there on the Titanic with a teacup trying to sort of throw the water over the side.
But maybe you don't need a plan B. Maybe you know, it's still your business model in a high altitude resort for the next 30 years is all you need. You know, not that you want to work.
Maybe that's the place to be.
Exactly. So it's I'm not trying to be provocative. I'm just wondering what kind of conversations you have with your colleagues about just this.
Yeah. I think there's a bit of that. I think you're right, and you know, honestly, without wanting to be whatever, but part of the reason why I chose to work in Zermatt in the first place is because it's the north-facing glacial resort that is theoretically open year-round for skiing, and is therefore fairly snowshore. So
you were quite prescient then, Rowena. Well done, you.
It was very selfish. I was just thinking about like how many days a year I'd be able to ski. That was all.
I see. Well, it served you well.
It's done so well so far, but I think maybe an interesting question then would be, what advice would I give to a young ski instructor looking to start out, or a young person who's looking potentially to get into the skiing industry? And I think I would definitely make sure that they pursued their passion, but had a pretty strong plan B, because, you know, the seasons are, you know, the kind of seasons we've been experiencing recently are only going to become more extreme. And, you know, I think we'll end up with something similar in the future, potentially, where we'll either have a huge winter or nothing at all. It will be the same in the States, or it'll be very rainy, like, which is actually a lot of which we had this year. So in fact, we had very warm Christmas, New Year period with a huge amount of rain, whereas normally that would fall obviously as snow. So just those like 2 or 3 degree temperature differences is enough to make a huge difference. So we're seeing the impact of that. So talking to young ski instructors now is, I mean, quite apart from anything to do with Brexit and anything else which makes things difficult, I would want them to definitely make the most of it and be able to ski when they can, but not expect that to be a career decision.
You must be a little bit sad when you give that kind of advice, because
very sad. Yeah. And the fact that we've seen this huge change in our lifetime is really sad. You know, being that generation feels very strange, and it sort of feels like we sort of have a slight responsibility, a huge responsibility to do something, even though I think it's very hard for us on an individual level to be able to make this huge impact, other than to make sure that we behave as we expect other people to, and hopefully act as good role models in terms of looking after our environment on a small scale or on a large scale.
Yeah, it's about personal responsibility.
Exactly.
Well, I'm going to pause the recording. I still have another question for you offline, but thank you so much for this. It's been great to chat with you. And I'll have a link to your landing page and your title. So you want Rowena Phillips, founder of the ski school, or
No, I'm not the founder, just the owner. We'll be fine. Thank you so much.
okay, well, that sounds good. All right, so then hang on.
Yep.